Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News YouTube channel. Today we have a little episode. We're going to be looking at some of the unusual tanks of Michigan. As some may or may not know, that is where I reside in the great state of Michigan, and Michigan, of course, has a long legacy and history as far as AFV development, history, and production. Obviously, with Detroit being one of the industrial center of the country during World War II, and tanks were obviously a big part of that. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that history was not preserved. There are no large private or public tank or military museums in Michigan with a large armor collection. However, there are tanks scattered about. Of course, anywhere you drive around, you're likely to see something in front of a VFW hall or an American Legion or an armory. And that's been documented. Fortunately, there is the U.S. Historical AFV Register, which is put together by some of the members of the AFV Association. And in particular, the Register, it's a couple guys, Michael Van Loon and Neil Baumgartner, who have been updating that registry over the years. And in fact, the latest edition just came out in February of this year, which is the volume 4.2. And the USA Registry just lists all the tanks that are on display in the country. So, for example, if you look in Michigan, you really can't go too far without tripping over an M60 of some sort. Looking at, looks like I counted at least 62 of them are in Michigan. So that's sort of the most common, but there's lots of other vehicles on display in various parts, and I just wanted to point out some of the more unusual ones in this video. Now we're going to start off not too far from where I live, Wyoming, Michigan, just south of Grand Rapids. There's a couple vehicles there, but the one worth noting for our purposes here is an M43 Gun Motor Carriage. Now this, of course, was design and production started right at the tail end of World War II. These saw service in Korea. Only about 48 were built, and only 3 or 4 of these are left in the world today. So one of them is here in Michigan, and these are some pictures that I took a couple years ago or so. Certainly an interesting vehicle if if you're interested in M4 Sherman tanks. It's worth looking out since it's based on that. Now next we're going to take a little jot down to the other side of the state, to Detroit, of course, and this here is a composite hull M4 Sherman with a 105mm gun. Now this is one of 7 known surviving composite hull M4. Now this particular tank was also the pilot for the M4 with the 105mm gun. And in fact, if you have a copy of Honeycutt's Sherman book laying around, you can find a picture of it on page 261, which I'll put up right here. And then, of course, also in the Detroit area in Warren, Michigan, is TACOM, stands for the U.S. Army Tank Automotive and Armaments Command. And on the grounds of that facility, they have a bunch of different vehicles on display, but sort of the rarest ones are, there's a T30 Heavy Tank, and this is one of 4 surviving T30 Heavy Tank pilots, I believe. Unfortunately, these, TACOM is not open to the public. You can't just drive onto the premises. Is like an entire city block and fenced off. So these pictures are not ones of my own. These are ones that are from the registry. Also on the grounds at TACOM is this T92 Howitzer motor carriage. Now this was a gigantic 240mm howitzer on a chassis of a T24E3. So essentially what would become the Pershing. They built 4 or 5 of these, I think, and then they didn't bother making any more because the war had ended, so this never saw combat. And then one of the other unusual vehicles on the grounds there is, this is a 1960s era vehicle, the XM808 Twister. It's built by Lockheed. This is one of the 2 prototypes that were built. Now next we're going to head back toward the center of the state to Fort Custer, which is a National Guard training facility between Kalamazoo and Battle Creek. Here we find what looks like a pretty ordinary M48 at first glance, but it's actually a T48E2. In particular, this one was known as Pilot 4, and then later this vehicle is also known as the Yuma Test Rig. Now the T48E2 project was an attempt to upgrade the M48 A1. Now the A1 had, the biggest problem was the fuel range just was not very good. So they decided to introduce a new engine for it, or a new version of the engine. So they went from the AV 1790 engine to the AVI 1790 engine, which introduced fuel injection. Also, they really there's a whole new rear end on the tank as far as the grills and whatnot. So they put on what's called the low IR deck and grills, and also a higher capacity fuel tanks, which did help increase the range of the vehicle by quite a bit. Now, this later on, the same vehicle would be used as a test bed for the very first prototypes of the diesel version of the 1790 engine, which was known as the AVDS 1790P. And that very first version prototype of the engine was put into this particular tank and sent out for testing at the Army's testing grounds in Yuma, and this was known as the Yuma Test Rig. Of course, here's a picture of it from page 150 of Honeycutt's patent book. And so, definitely a rather interesting M48, or I should say T48. And, you know, if you look at these pictures here, you can see these sort of large non-standard external air filters, which look a little different than what you normally see on these vehicles. Next, we're going to go just a bit south of Kalamazoo to the town of Dowagiac, where there's an armory, and out in front of that armory is what looks like a really rather poor condition M103 heavy tank sitting out front. And at least that's what I thought it was when I took these pictures of it a couple years ago. But based on the notes provided in the AFV registry, the hull of this vehicle is actually one of the early T43 or T43E1 tanks that never got upgraded to the M103 standard. Apparently there were 6 of them that never got upgraded, so were used for various testing purposes. This one certainly looks like it's seen better days, particularly if you go around to the back. First thing I noticed when I had to go look at this thing is that all the engine grill is gone, both the rear and the top grills, replaced just with some sheet metal. I mean, you can tap on it, and it's kind of obviously is a very sort of thin sheet metal that's just put in there to cover the hole. So it is possible that perhaps, there's no definitive proof, but it could be that this hull was used for testing the AVDS 1790, the diesel engine, when they upgraded this thing when they decided to take the M103 to the A2 standard. So that's at least, I think, one fairly good possibility to explain this rather poor condition vehicle. As to the turret, you know, it's hard to say if the turret is original to the vehicle or not. It appears to be an M103A1 turret. You know, the thing too is with pretty much from the M48 onward, every single U.S. tank has the 85-inch turret ring, so it's not very hard for turrets to be swapped out, and you will see that, especially on some of these display vehicles that are made out of some of these sort of leftover prototypes that are laying around. They'll just sort of throw a turret on it and call it good enough for, you know, being a monument tank. Now we're going to head back up north a little ways to the west coast of Michigan, to Muskegon. And at the VFW Hall on Getty Street, Muskegon, there is this M48A1. Now, at first glance, this M48 doesn't look all that out of the ordinary, other than it's an M48A1. And you generally don't find these sort of really early production models that much on displays. Most of the M48s you're going to find are going to be A2s or A3s. So it's kind of fun to see an A1, but that's not the main reason I'm bringing this one up. It's if you look on the engine deck, there's these 2 sort of exhaust pipes sticking out, which aren't supposed to be there. Those are definitely not part of the original deck layout of this vehicle. And it's interesting, when I was taking these pictures, it's been 2 or 3 years ago, somebody from the hall came out to sort of find out what we were doing, you know, make sure we weren't crawling on the tank or something. And, you know, I asked him sort of what he knew about it, and mostly what he knew was wrong. But he did say that he said that this particular tank came from across the street. Now, across the street, on Getty Street there, is the engine plant that was the Teledyne Continental engine plant, later owned by General Dynamics and now L3 Communications. And so that's interesting. It may explain those exhaust pipes, if this is some sort of M48 that was used for a diesel conversion. And the only thing I can think that sort of went into service that's comparable to this. Now certainly there were plenty of M8s that were, or M48s that were converted into diesels, but they generally had the entire the rear end redone with low IR deck and grills and higher capacity fuel tanks and all that stuff that we saw with the A2 upgrade. You know, this one here, they're keeping the rear end of the A1, but putting a diesel in it. And the only people I know who did that was Taiwan with their the CM12. And if you look at pictures, I'll show you one, you can sort of see that they're not the same style of exhaust port, but they're in the same place. So I don't know if this was part of that. I'm not exactly sure who designed that upgrade for Taiwan. There's not a lot of information out there, but that's my best guess. Now, if we move across the street to the actual, what's now the L3 Combat Propulsion's factory, and you go down the sort of service lane on the left-hand side, you'll pass four sort of forlorn-looking vehicles sitting out there on the side of a building that have been there quite a while. Nothing's been done with them. And those consist of three of the vehicles that are pretty unusual and interesting. The first is an M47 that's out there that obviously there's something that's been done with the grill on the back. I assume, again, this is an attempt to put a diesel engine into M47, which did happen with the M47Ms. A lot of those went to Iran, but this one must be a different project. And from what I understand, people have contacted the factory, whether they be collectors or private museums wanting to purchase it. Nobody's quite sure or has the documentation as far as who owns this thing. I have it on fairly good authority that this vehicle was supplied by Italy way back in the day to Continental to do their tests on, but I don't really have details beyond that. And but as far as I understand it, this thing's sort of in limbo and just sort of sitting there, which is unfortunate because there's probably a lot of collectors or museums that would love to get their hands on an M47 and restore it. Now, next to it, the sort of slopey-looking vehicle there, that is what's left of the expeditionary tank that Teledyne Continental produced back in the 80s when there was the whole light tank program that produced the Stingray from Cadillac Gage, and FMC had what would become the M8 Buford, which was the one that actually won the program, but then never went into production. Ironically, the Teledyne Expeditionary Tank, which was sort of a low hull with this overhead gun system on it, the vehicle itself wouldn't go anywhere, but the gun system part of it would later get slapped on top of a Striker and turned into the M1128 mobile gun system. So kind of ironic that at least the gun part of it kind of won by losing. Anyhow, sort of what's left of that vehicle sitting there, and then if we move over a little bit, the hull that looks sort of like it has Centurion treads, that's because it's pretty sure that's a Centurion. Teledyne also was trying to market that overhead gun system as a replacement for conventional turrets on older vehicle platforms as an upgrade, and one of the things they marketed was a Centurion hull that was up-armored with this gun system in it, and you can see pictures of that system exist. So we know it was out there, and it's probably a pretty good guess that that's what that Centurion hull with that extra armor on it is. Unfortunately, since these vehicles are on the plant grounds, you can't really get very close. I mean, you can't just walk in there. There's security and all that business. So the only pictures I have are just these sort of ones from a distance. And then the fourth vehicle there is just it's a AVLB, not terribly interesting. So that's Muskegon. Now we're going to end with probably, I think, one of the most interesting tanks you can find in Michigan, and that is in Armada, Michigan, which is a small town on the southeast side of the state. And it is in front of an AMVETS Post 93. And this is, again, one of those instances where a hull and a turret got thrown together that wouldn't necessarily have started out together. It is a XM66D turret. Now, this is one of the turrets that was sort of an early version of what would end up on the M60A2, what's sometimes referred to as the Starship. So it's supposed to be a smaller, lower profile turret somewhat. It's got the 152 millimeter gun slash missile launcher, shillelagh launcher, sort of like the similar to the, essentially the same as the weapon system on the Sheridan, or very similar. And then the hull is one of the two prototype hulls that was used for the M48A3. So this was an earlier M48 hull. There were two of them that they used when they were creating the M48A3. M48A3, of course, is when they converted the M48 from the gasoline engine to the diesel, the AVDS 1790. So certainly an unusual vehicle, because this turret was originally designed to go on an M60 hull. Here they're putting on an M48 hull. So, I mean, if you look in Honeycutt, you won't find a picture of these two items together. This was sort of, I think, something that they pieced together to put out on display. And originally this tank was displayed in Detroit at one of the government facilities. How it got out here to Armada, Michigan, I have no idea. But it's certainly an interesting vehicle, and one you are guaranteed not to find a copy of anywhere else. So that's my little tour of some of the strange and unique tanks you can find in Michigan. If you want to look for some of these vehicles, or for vehicles in your own neck of the woods, of course, please go ahead and download the USA Historical AFV Register, and we'll put a link to that in the video description. Most of the photos in this video I took myself. There are some that I had to borrow from the web, so just wanted to note that as well. Thank you as well to the people that put together the registry. It's a great resource, and if any of the people that work on that watch this and they know more about these vehicles, or if there's anything in this video that's incorrect, please let me know in the comments. I will put out a correction. Love to learn more about these particular vehicles that are in my neck of the woods. Thank you very much, and we will catch you on the next one.